Hey Art History, it's Mrs. Jones. Today we are going to talk about some different two-dimensional media. Previously we had been talking about the elements and principles and just started our discussion about drawing and the functions of drawing. I want to remind you that through this boot camp, we are really thinking about increasing our vocabulary of different artists and art terms. So that when we are discussing or writing about art, we're using proper vocabulary. But we also, in this class, are really seeking to understand the intention of the artist, as well as the process in which it was made, learn about different techniques, and overall, hopefully, learning about those things is going to help us to have a deeper appreciation. Now, we may not want to hang it over our couch and decorate with this piece of art, but, we can understand and appreciate the intent behind it. So previously, we had been talking about the functions of drawing, that many artists use drawing as a way of storytelling or documenting different studies as they are planning things out. Some of them use drawing to record their observations or as a tool of discovery. And most importantly, for personal expression. So today we're going to dive into just a real quick crash course of some of the common media that you will often encounter when you would be visiting an art gallery or a museum. And again, we're talking about two-dimensional art. So here we go. We are going to look at some different drawing media and techniques. We're first going to talk about graphite, and previously we mentioned that, this is a material most of us are pretty familiar with, that it's something that we learn at a very early age when we start in school, but mastering graphite with shading and such to make something look three-dimensional is actually pretty hard. I want to quickly show you an example of a drawing by an artist named Armin Mersmann. He's actually an artist up in Michigan, so very nearby. And I had the chance to meet Armin when he was giving a lecture at St. Francis and had an exhibition here in Fort Wayne. His work is incredibly detailed, incredibly detailed. I mean, if you did not know that this was graphite, you might mistake it for a photograph. And so it's that attention to detail that is just so exquisite with graphite. Kind of a cousin to drawing with graphite would be metal point, and it's an ancient ancestor to pencil. We see this a lot during Renaissance, and you're literally using a piece of metal to scratch into a coated surface. And so it behaves very similarly to a pencil in terms of technique. You're using very fine motor skills. You are building up value through creating different lines and etc. And so some people might even mistake looking at a metal point or a print of something like this that we're seeing as a drawing. So again, make sure you always know what the medium is when you are discussing or writing about a work of art. Another common drawing media that you may encounter is charcoal, and I love charcoal. It's super messy, but it's very fluid, it's easily blended, and this is a medium that quite a few artists like to use to make preliminary studies. So the piece that you're seeing by Paul Gauguin on the right is an example of a preliminary study for a painting. Oftentimes artists want to map things out and get an understanding of light and value and shadow in a medium that takes less time, something that is very quick and accessible prior to making a larger scale work. Now, I mentioned scale. These images by contemporary artist Robert Longo are actually very huge. So you don't really get a sense of scale in these, but again, they are so photorealistic. You might mistake them for a photograph. But he is a master of charcoal and value, and using a full range of value and light and dark to create these objects to look three-dimensional. Chalk pastel and Conté crayon. It's all about the binder, baby. I personally love chalk pastel. I draw with it quite frequently. I love layering it. And again, similar to charcoal, you can blend it with your finger. And I just think it is lovely. Conté crayon is a little bit more greasy, but it actually is more permanent than chalk pastel. It's a little harder to blend because of its oily nature, but I want to show you really quickly an image by Edgar Degas. When you look at Degas' work, his mastery of this medium is absolutely stunning. I love seeing all of the layers of color and how he changes directions with his application to kind of model the form of the dancers. A contemporary artist who is working in chalk pastel is Zaria Foreman, and her works, as you can see, are fairly large scale, and a lot of her works are dealing with climate change. Her approach to chalk pastel is much more tight in comparison to Edgar Degas, who is using the medium very expressively. Moving on really quickly with pen and ink. This is something that, I don't know, it's a blessing and a curse. I think pen and ink is fun, but man, it is a hard beast to tame. So when I see works like this that are just loose and expressive and still have a nice value range, I very much admire them, because all of my attempts with pen and ink have been very, very messy. Now we are moving on to my love, which is painting. Now, the first type of painting we're going to talk about is encaustic, and we're actually going to revisit encaustic when we start talking about early Greek and Roman statues, because many of their statues and even some of the temples at the Greek Acropolis were painted with this technique. So encaustic actually means that you're mixing the pigment with wax and you're heating it up. And so when the wax cools, the paint kind of hardens. And encaustic actually means to burn in. So here we're seeing an ancient example. And in the next slide, we see a contemporary example. This artist is Jasper Johns. And you can see just how lovely and rich the texture is. The next type of paint medium we are going to discuss is fresco. And again, we are going to revisit this later on, especially when we get to the Renaissance. And this is the technique that Michelangelo used to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling and the Last Judgment scene at the end of the chapel. But fresco is a technique where you're actually mixing the pigment with plaster. And so as the plaster and pigment combination dries, it is literally having a chemical transformation. So the pigment and the plaster is binding together, and it's a very resilient medium. You can see in my note here that Michelangelo could only cover about 1 square yard a day. This technique required a lot of careful planning. And if you look at a lot of the ancient murals and things, these were very large scale surfaces. So it is definitely a technique to be admired. A more contemporary example would be that of Diego Rivera. He is a Mexican muralist, and he often did large scale frescoes. A lot of times the medium of fresco was associated with architecture. Moving on to tempera. Tempera paint is probably what you all first experienced in elementary school, kindergarten kind of painting. Tempera paint is a water-based paint like watercolor, but it's very, very tough when it dries. One of my favorite examples of an artist using tempera paint is this by Andrew Wyeth. This particular painting is a part of a larger series that was kept secret from the art world for nearly 15 years, and it's of a woman named Helga. Even his wife didn't know that these existed. It's actually a really fascinating story if you are interested in history. Moving on to oil paint. Oil paint is a pigment suspended in oil. It's definitely a much slower drying process. I am a little bit impatient when it comes to oil paint. The painting you see here is by Jan van Eyck, and it is a legend that Jan van Eyck is actually the first to experiment with this new medium in his portrait here. One of my favorite artists that uses oil paints is Vincent van Gogh. And you can see these are actually photographs that I took at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And one of the qualities that I love when I am looking at painting is texture. That is one of the elements of art that I truly admire. And Vincent van Gogh painted with a very loaded brush. And this technique is called impasto. So you can see in the image here on the left, this is a cross section here that I've taken at an angle, and you can literally see that paint projecting from the canvas. It is so wonderful to see in person. I'm sure many of you are familiar with watercolor, again, from your elementary school days. So watercolor is water-based, but typically when we see watercolor paintings, they're much smaller. And the whole premise is that you are using the white of your paper to show through as the white in the painting. So when we look at this example by Winslow Homer, all of this white in the surf and the highlights in the rocks and in the sky, that's actually the white of the paper showing through. So with watercolor, you really have to be planning out where your highlight areas of value will be. Another example of watercolor is that of Paul Cézanne, and you can see you can use watercolor very versatilely. You can use it to be very detailed and refined, or like Paul Cézanne, you can use it very expressively. A cousin to watercolor is gouache. And so this is very similar to watercolor in that it is water-based and you're still building up these small layers, but they add white pigment to it, which makes the colors much more opaque. Watercolor tends to be very translucent. Now, my favorite type of paint is acrylic. And the invention of acrylic paint was in the early 30s. And acrylic paint is actually mixed with a little bit of synthetic plastic resin. And it's considered the universal paint medium. It can mimic the effects of oil. If we think back to Vincent van Gogh and that lovely impasto, that texture that protrudes from the canvas, it can do that. Or you can thin it down with water and use it like watercolor. Now it's time to start talking about technique with painting. This is an image that is poured acrylic on canvas by Helen Frankenthaler. Frankenthaler worked horizontally on the floor and would pour paint onto unprimed canvas. Because the canvas was unprimed, the paint would flow very differently. It would absorb differently into the fabric. And you can see that this is a very large scale piece. This is 6 foot by 6 foot. Another artist who liked to work horizontally and fling paint was Jackson Pollock. You can see in this image with the viewer standing in front of this Pollock painting, they were pretty large scale. And this is definitely one of the artists that I find that most people argue about, this style of art. You know, I could do that. I could fling paint and do that in my garage. Why is he famous? You know, why is this worth millions of dollars? Well, that, my friends, is something that you are going to find out in your assignment. One of the cool things that you don't really notice when you look at Jackson Pollock's work is all of the random bits of debris that you can find in his artwork. See here, you can see nails, a button. Sometimes I've even seen a cigarette butt. He was definitely a chain smoker. Pollock just embraced this as a part of his process. And now you are about to learn a little bit more about Jackson Pollock and his process.